Hello and welcome back to the Blue Goat Cyber monthly webinar. Today we have a really exciting topic. We're going to be talking about hacking into medical devices. We're going to look at some of the different types of security testing that is required by the FDA and the standards that we choose to adhere to based off of FDA requirements. We're also going to look at some really exciting case studies and real life stories from our Director of MedTech Cybersecurity, Myles Kellerman. He has very deep knowledge and deep experience in penetration testing medical devices and is an amazing resource and has some awesome stories to tell. How are you doing today, Myles?
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Well, we can go ahead and jump right into it. Now, the first thing that I want to cover is why is cybersecurity testing important? Recently, and as of 2023, and then more recently, as of last month in 2025, the FDA is pushing out very strict guidance on what is required for cybersecurity, and that includes cybersecurity testing. There's a pretty wide range of cybersecurity testing activities. We'll take a look at what all of those are in a second. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is identify flaws that an attacker could use or a bad guy could try to leverage to compromise the security or safety of a device or the environment where it's in. It's important to consider that environment as well as the device, since often these are going to be in a hospital where there are other critical care systems in place. Cybersecurity testing is now mandated by the FDA and other regulatory authorities. So this isn't something that you're able to easily get past on your way to regulatory approval or clearance. Cybersecurity testing can provide assurance to customers that your product is safe and effective, as well as to the regulators. And so going through into integration into like a healthcare delivery organization or any other center where they're going to be using your medical device, the customers are going to want to feel that confidence that you have a safe and secure product as they are taking on some of the risk and liability of integrating that device into their environment. Finally, mishandling cybersecurity testing can lead to regulatory compliance roadblocks and rejections. Now, what that means is if cybersecurity testing has been mishandled and you submit into the FDA, it's likely that they're going to reject it, stating that there was no testing or there was insufficient testing. This can be a pretty big problem since then you have to go back, perform all of this testing, and if any big problems are identified, that can lead to a lengthy review cycle. Oftentimes, this can push back your time to market by as long as 6 months or even longer. So what we're trying to do is do this early cybersecurity testing to cover any of these problems and address them ahead of time in the pre-market phase when we have plenty of time to move forward to the submission. All right. Now, there are a few different types of testing that we have to cover. Testing is based off of NIST Special Publication 800-115. We'll take a look at some of the details for that standard here in a second. But Myles has some great experience and some great information to share regarding what some of these different types of testing are and what they include. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to share some insight on these different testing activities.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So within the requirements that we have here, we touch a lot of these, if not all of them, during our testing with medical devices. All of them have their kind of respective discipline on the way you test with these. But to jump right into it, penetration testing, we use the typical penetration testing framework, which is you're going to gather reconnaissance and kind of move through that type of organization of testing. Security requirements testing, that's going to be more around, if a product's being built with security requirements in mind, testing those specific requirements, maybe as that device is being built, or testing a prototype of some kind. Vulnerability assessments are a subset of penetration testing. The vulnerability assessment focuses more on finding just above the surface, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, as far as the vulnerabilities that are out there, but typically used as a way to identify those vulnerabilities based off of known vulnerabilities in the wild, right? You're not going to find anything that's 0-day or maybe something that's like a multi-vector attack, right? They don't have the CVEs produced or those vulnerabilities put together. For the static and dynamic code analysis, we're going to see that more on the software side of the house. So just for example, the mobile device testing, the static side, we're looking at what vulnerabilities exist in the code base and what third-party libraries are used along with that may be vulnerable or have vulnerabilities within them. And that kind of addresses the SBOM vulnerability analysis at the bottom that we have here. For the dynamic code analysis, that's going to be like testing the workflow of the application. So how does authentication work when I log in as a user? Are there vulnerabilities wrapped around that? And how are, just as in one example, how does the backend API handle different calls, and are those secure as well? Fuzz testing is going to kind of be above and beyond what vulnerability assessments can provide. That's going to be a little bit more of looking for things that may not exist or be known to exist as far as documented vulnerabilities, and trying to find these vulnerabilities through fuzz testing can be, what do I want to say? It can go a further length of time when trying to test for fuzz testing vulnerabilities. When you're doing so, you're usually running through a lot of different, what do I want to say? Different,
like different types of input. So you're sort of
yeah.
seeing how the product responds to different input and see if any input triggers a strange response, more or less. Is that about right?
Yes, absolutely. With fuzz testing as well, you're going to be able to chain certain things with vulnerabilities that may already exist as well. And as far as vulnerability chaining, that would be one example. So you can either find a documented vulnerability that's out there, take advantage of that vulnerability and build upon it, and chain that vulnerability into another direction of what you're testing. And then the robustness testing is just making sure that you cover everything that's in the NIST SP 800-115 as far as testing all the particular areas for the medical device that's under review or under test. Now, a lot of these types of testing is kind of not one size fits all. You have to know the device's weaknesses, strengths, and do a little bit of research on what the device capability is and work with that medical device client's team in order to make sure you have a great understanding of what your testing points are, how you're going to test the device, and what the ultimate result of that testing is going to be. SBOM analysis, that's strictly on the vulnerability testing side of the house. We kind of already talked about that with looking at third-party libraries. That's going to be part of your code base or application testing. But that rounds that out for the types of testing.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Now I'd like to dive in a little bit more about NIST Special Publication 800-115 as well. So this is meant to be a handbook of methodologies for vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, security audits, and it covers all of the activities that Myles just described. So in addition to the actual activities themselves, it talks about some of the planning, execution, reporting phases. So we're looking at a little bit more of the prep work and then sort of the after effect, some of the artifacts that we're preparing as a result of this testing. It's often said in cybersecurity that a penetration test is only as good as the report that comes from it, since that report is what's really truly delivering value. So NIST SP 800-115 is trying to standardize a little bit what that report looks like. We're also looking at some of the technique overviews, so things like scanning, the fuzz testing, social engineering simulations. Some of these aren't going to be as applicable to medical devices. However, it's a very wide range that it's capturing. And so the things that are applicable to medical devices are very well covered in here. It also looks at some sample reporting templates and metrics for severity and remediation tracking. Now, this is a US government endorsed playbook for pen testing scope, tools, tester qualifications. It's explicitly called out by the FDA as one of their preferred testing methodologies. There are a couple of options here, but NIST SP 800-115 is the main one. Its terminology is also lined up with what the FDA expects to see for ongoing scanning and post-market testing. Now, there are a couple of common testing findings that we see here. I'll go over some of these and then I'll turn it over to Myles to cover up some of the other ones here. Weak encryption is largely when we're looking at something that is not properly encoded, properly encrypted, so that information is visible and plain to read to anyone, or it is not encrypted in a sufficient way where someone can't break the encryption. This can be at rest and in transit. So at rest being a stored bit of data. Think of like a database. This could be a file or maybe like cloud storage. In transit would be the transfer of data. So the connection over USB or Wi-Fi, or even you could think about the connection from my microphone to the computer. That is data in transit. Broken access control is extremely common. What this means is that one user can access another user or another privilege's information. Another privilege would be, say, if a normal user can access an admin panel, or user A can access user B's information. Sensitive information disclosure is just pulling out any information that is going to be sensitive and relevant. So think of protected health information or personally identifiable information. Those are very important on the medical space, of course, but in cybersecurity in general. Now, the next thing is going to be around excessive permissions. This will be mostly focused on, we'll say, an application that has too many privileges, or a user role is able to access functionality that they don't necessarily need. But it can be a little bit flexible, since it can be a person or a service that has this excessive level of access. All right, the last one that I'm going to go over is the insecure session management. And then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Myles to cover some of these other ones. Insecure session management is meant to be a little bit of a blanket term. So when we have a session, think of a single instance of an individual doing something. For an example, I currently have a session on Riverside. There is a credential that I put in and it says that it's me that is doing this. Now, if that is mishandled, if there is a way that maybe these session tokens that say I am who I am have too much information, or they can be captured by someone else, or they don't ever expire so that this session keeps on going even after I log out, that would be some examples of insecure session management. All right, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Myles. We have a couple more to go over, some common pen test findings that I know you see pretty often on a lot of your tests.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the common testing findings here, unprotected physical ports, we see this a lot. A lot of clients have many questions on as far as how deep they need to protect a physical port, whether secured with screws or a little door cover, or just having a hard case or tamper-proof seal to protect that physical port. But we see this all the time. Typically, if the device comes with 2 Ethernet ports and the client software is only using one, then the best practice would be to try to shield that second port. The out-of-date third-party components piece kind of ties back to the SBOM and then even into web application testing. We see a lot of things there with outdated JavaScript components and other libraries that exist. When it comes to doing the static code analysis and running tools for SBOM, we'll identify a lot of vulnerabilities within the libraries that are part of that code base. The hard-coded secrets, along the same lines of what we just talked about for the static code analysis, we'll find that there's variables in there where the actual password is embedded in the code instead of using just a non-attributable variable in its place. So that's a finding we find quite often. Insecure operating system configurations, that's highly consistent with a lot of Windows 10 devices that we test against. It's going to be everything from what could be locked down through group policy to even not having a password protected BIOS. Just talking about, software on the particular machine. But and when there's software or proprietary software that runs on a Windows device, you're going to want to make sure that how your software is configured within a Windows environment is secure as well. So Trevor kind of hinted to that with excessive permissions and certain things like that. Broken authentication, we see that quite often as well. Whenever a customer has a medical device and we're performing the web application portion of the testing, especially when it comes to backend APIs, we'll find that some of the APIs are not secured or don't require authentication, and so that rounds that out.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for going over some of those. I know on a lot of the tests we're seeing, I mentioned that broken access control is super common, but insecure operating systems, likely one of the most common findings that we see. During testing, even the FDA specifies that certain operating systems are just inherently going to be exposed to more risk. So specifically quoting what needs to be done as far as antivirus protections. The FDA states that for Windows, it is recommended in most cases, but if you're looking at a Linux operating system, it's not as required. The reason for that is Windows is prone to more vulnerabilities due to the fact that it's more heavily researched. Most people use Windows. Windows Active Directory is used by well over 90% of Fortune 500 companies. So it's going to be the highest value to research Windows as the main point of target for attackers. Next thing that I want to go into is the OWASP testing frameworks. So OWASP is the Open Web Application Security Project. And while they're saying web application security, they have branched out and do an amazing job covering test cases, practices, and just providing fantastic knowledge to the security community for a wide range of technology and use cases. A lot of security testers and penetration testers are familiar with the term the OWASP Top 10. And that can apply to a mobile application, a web application, even now into AI models, and where you're looking at some of the most common and often the most severe findings are. This is guidance across all industries, so it's applicable to automotive, financial, healthcare, general data protection, though, of course, this can all apply to medical devices as well, as ultimately security is going to be like an objective solution for security. A remediation path is going to be consistent no matter the context. It's more the impact, the scope, the severity that changes based on the context. And so medical is going to be different from other industries. This can be a great starting point for test case development. This will tie us right back into NIST 800-115. That standard requires that we develop a test plan and test cases. So OWASP testing frameworks often can act as a great starting point to build out some of these test cases. Now, I also want to mention some of the security testing artifacts. The security testing is going to prepare multiple different deliverables that go into this FDA submission. It's not just going to be one report covering everything. Tying right back into what I was mentioning based off of the NIST 800-115 requirements, there's going to be test plans that are essentially outlining what are we doing, when are we doing it, who's doing it, and how are they doing it. The test cases are the specific exploits we're trying to identify. So as we're going through our threat modeling exercise, we derive that into what we think might be possible to do to the device. We stem those into our test cases. So it's an individual attack saying, we are going to check this login page and see if it lets you use a weak password, for an example. And if we can, that's a failed test case. Our penetration test report is largely just going to be the outcome of these test cases. So whether or not they passed, and if they failed, what should we do to fix it? Vulnerability assessment reports are going to be flexible depending on the tool, depending on the technology. There are a lot of different industry standard tools out there, and each one has a way to sort of put out a report. Vulnerability assessments can often be thought of as automated penetration testing. It covers a lot of ground very fast, but doesn't go very deep. And so it provides a good initial analysis view. SAST report, or static application security testing, is purely a look at any coding flaws. So vulnerabilities introduced by weak coding practices. The SBOM vulnerability analysis report is going to be a list of any known CVEs or common vulnerabilities in a device. That is going to cover every bit of technology in the system in that software. So if there is a third-party component that uses another third-party component, it will pick up those vulnerabilities as well. Finally, we'll have security requirements testing traceability. This is not necessarily going to be purely a cybersecurity deliverable, while the other areas generally are. The reason for this is requirement testing traceability is a software problem. We have requirements. A functional requirement is what does it do, and a non-functional requirement is how does it do it. Security requirements are a type of non-functional requirement. We're saying, how do we ensure that a normal use case for a device is secure? For an example, I can say a functional requirement of a cell phone is to connect to Wi-Fi, connect to the internet, and a non-functional security requirement is to ensure that communication is encrypted so no one can read it if they're listening on the network. So we're having all of these different requirements, and traceability is verification that they're in place. So for the phone example, the functional requirement is, does it have Wi-Fi? Can it connect to Wi-Fi? And then the security requirements traceability would be, if we sit and listen in on the wire, we listen to the communications going on in that network. Can we see anything going by unencrypted? That traceability is going to be the outcome of the test case, similar to the penetration testing, but more from a software angle. All right, now we'd like to go over a couple of case studies that showcase just how severe the cybersecurity impact can be if vulnerabilities are in a product. This first is going to be a critical breach that Myles had discovered during a penetration test, where he was able to expose massive amounts of information through a pretty severe security misconfiguration, although a very slight misconfiguration by the development team. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Myles, to just provide a little bit of story on the timeline there.
Yeah, so this was a fun test, as you mentioned. So with this particular test, what really kind of happened is, when we start testing, we want to look at the web application in kind of like different sections, right? So like authentication would be the first thing we look at. That's kind of the first thing the user experiences anyway, right? So when you log in, what happens? With this particular attack, what I noticed is when my user logged in, I was provided with information about my user, in JSON format. And this was communicating through the API in order to pull this data forward to paint in the GUI for me to see. So I have user information coming back. Then that user information was being brought back through a post request. From that point, I was able to change the post request to a get request, essentially kind of breaking how the logic's supposed to work with the web application. And just a very simple attack, mind you, by doing that. And essentially what I was able to do is force the GUI or the web app to request to the API to get all users. And I didn't know that at the time, right, what I would get when I would play the GET request. But that particular request had no limitations on the data that was retrieved. And just by changing that HTTP verb, so to speak, or tampering that, I was able to bring that data forward. And that data resulted in all users on the system and their metadata. And, it led to information disclosure and, some other vulnerabilities kind of all chained together. Now, with that being said, that is a normal thing that we find whenever customers are building web apps or medical device web apps, that when they start involving API security is very big, and there are a lot of exploits. If you're not tailoring that API call to do one specific thing under a very limited context, then an attacker can most likely elicit data that you didn't think you could get through that API. So it's very important to make sure that your endpoints are secure and that they're only making requests that should be allowed. Now, in this example, the developers should have only allowed just the post request and put HTTP verb security or tamper security around that. I should not be able to replay a GET request and get all the users in the particular web app's data. Yeah, that was pretty fun. From there as well, we took this attack one step further. So on top of being able to use a GET request to get more data, we were able to check to see if we could do that unauthenticated through the API. So that would kind of be your next step. Okay, I can get this data. Now can I get it without being authenticated? So you simply delete your cookie out of your request and you replay that request and check the results. In this particular case, we were able to do such that. So now we have an even more higher risk finding because I cannot be logged in, query the API, and get everything that is supposed to be behind an authentication mechanism, on top of getting data that I'm not allowed to see. So it was kind of a two-part hit. And then from there, there's basically wrapping some automation around that through curl requests and bash scripting and things like that to automate the process. But this would be a good example of kind of chaining two vulnerabilities together that were found. One, changing the post to the GET request, and then two, deleting the cookie and realizing you can get this large amount of data, valuable data at that, while not being authenticated.
So to make sure I understand how this all tied together, you're able to see that not only could you pull out a lot of personally identifiable information, which in a security context, hackers are looking for this to try to craft phishing attacks, try to strip out information, try to scam people. And so not only were you able to pull out so much of this information, but anyone could do it since you didn't require a login, no username, no password. So just whoever wanted could access all this information. Is that right?
That's correct.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty scary one.
Yeah. The
Right.
scariest part about that is there are a lot of attackers or bad actors out there that continuously scan different companies' APIs, and they're directly looking for new authentication API calls that work. So
Totally.
just put that out there.
All right. Now, another case study. This is a little bit less of a complicated attack, but still very, very critical to look at. So oftentimes we'll see that we should expect security in layers. It's called the defense in depth or the onion model, where you expect to have a control close to the sensitive functionality or information and more controls branching out further and further. Now, one of those easy controls is going to be, we'll think of a password on the outside, maybe a lock behind the door to the room with the computer. And one of them is reducing your privileges inside of the computer, even past all of this. We were able to find a system where everything was logged in default as administrators, which is unfortunately a little bit all too common. And actually, the next two findings and case studies we're going to go over were over the same system. I'll let Myles provide a little more context on what he found here.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. With this particular chain of vulnerabilities that we have here, because that's really what this was at the time, just a little bit of background. A lot of clients, when they come to us, they think they have a very great developed, secure product. There are a lot of things that we bring to light as far as what, environment this operates in. Some of these devices can't guarantee that they operate in a secure environment due to insider threat happenings. But outside of that, when we come and test the physical medical devices, let's say at a client site or whatnot, we typically run into issues like this where the Windows operating system or the device itself is really not in a good security baseline wrapped around the device as a whole. So with this, we will find that the client has a really great piece of software that they developed in-house that runs on a Windows system. However, that Windows system does not have all the proper security that it should have to prevent a physical attacker from doing bad things. So for this example, we walked up to this device to attack it. We realized that the administrator auto logs in, and not a low privileged user like you would think, but an administrator auto logs in. And after that, it's all downhill from there. We use different attack methods or different test cases that involve USBs and other testing device like the Bash Bunny, where we can run payloads and things like that. From here, using a Rogue keyboard and being able to navigate the Windows menu as the administrator, it was pretty much game over right off the bat. And there is typically a kiosk mode that we experience with other clients that have a little bit more cyber hygiene behind their product. And that is always preferred to kind of keep that software in a stripped down environment to kind of limit the attack surface from physical attacks. But in this particular case, there was no kiosk mode. And so we were able to provide recommendations for this case study and get the developers to lock down the operating system, have a really good security controls baked into the OS, and then have that low privileged user log into a kiosk environment where only that client's homegrown software, in order to manage their instrument that it was connected to be set up and activated. So
perfect. Yeah, and this will tie us right into the next finding, which, as I mentioned, was already on the same device. And this was where we were able to override the operating system. So for a little background on how this works, above the operating system, there is something called the BIOS, which is essentially what loads into your operating system, loads your file system, all of that on the computer. Now, you can change what order you're loading certain things, and so you can pick an operating system to load on top of it if the BIOS isn't protected, which is what we were able to do in this case, and is unfortunately a far too common vulnerability. We see it on most similar devices, since by default, BIOSes are not protected. But it is one of the most severe problems that we can identify due to the unrestricted access that it gives it. I'll let Myles talk a little bit about what that access looks like.
Yeah, so this is a super, super scary problem, and it is one we see far too often when we're doing our testing. So this is a number one hit area for all attackers trying to gain physical access to your device, plain and simple. It is actually, if the device is in an off state to begin with, as soon as you boot the device, this is the first available attack vector when talking about it in that manner. Simply, not password protecting your BIOS leads to all kinds of issues, from being able to change boot order to turning off other security configurations to basically being able to sometimes interact with the hardware that's designed into the device that maybe the client didn't intend to use, but now an attacker can turn these interfaces on and basically be able to add to maybe an exfiltration pathway into their attack vector. Something as an example would be either like Bluetooth or wireless communication. If those modules are on the board itself, the hardware, the BIOS can interact with those things. So it's highly important to have a security baseline wrapped around your BIOS, not simply just adding a password, but actually get into those settings and figure out what you need or don't need in order to manage the device hardware. Outside of that, when you do leave that password off or leave a default password that we can easily look up online for that particular type of BIOS, we can load a USB with a live operating system on it, typically Kali Linux or whatever the attacker's choice of operating system would be. And from there, we can change the boot order to force your device to boot from that USB as the first option, bypassing Windows and any kind of security you have past the BIOS, right? And then what happens next is the screen you see. We're loading a security Linux operating system with all the tools I need in order to observe, look through all your data on the Windows file system that is on that hard drive and any other partition that may exist that holds data, to include any other USB devices that may be used to back up logs or what have you, depending on what your medical device setup is. We've been able to, navigate and observe attached devices that have memory, right? So the only saving grace to this piece is having really good operating system security. So having, as an example, BitLocker turned on, your view would be if you try to click on the particular, Windows directory that holds all the Windows files, that's going to be locked, or it's going to ask for a password to access that particular directory because BitLocker is turned on. So the next step would be to roll this back further, add the BIOS password, make sure you apply your baseline security controls to the BIOS, and then make sure you have that data at rest encryption turned on, which would be BitLocker for dealing with Windows.
And the good news is those are both really easy fixes to implement. So despite the fact this is such a severe finding and such a common one, it's a super simple fix, which is great news for the defenders and for the manufacturers. Perfect. All right, now we'll go ahead and look at who should be doing testing. Now, we've covered all of the different artifacts that we prepare, all of the different types of cybersecurity testing, but who is going to be responsible for each of these? Now, in general, testing should be performed by trained security specialists. It takes a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge to interpret some of these findings, even from automated tooling like vulnerability assessment. But when we're moving into more of a manual approach, penetration testing, fuzz testing, dynamic testing, that requires some know-how and some knowledge on how to properly perform these tests, execute all these different tasks. Now, for penetration testing specifically, there's a large push from the FDA and for most industries to have this done by a third-party company. So that means not the manufacturer. One distinction with the FDA is that the penetration testers should have proven expertise in testing medical equipment. It's different. The risk assessment methodology is very different. We're considering patient safety as opposed to purely security impact. There are a couple of other ethical reasons as well why we want to see penetration testing done by third parties and why there's a big push for that. I'll let Myles talk a little bit about some of those ethical considerations.
Yeah, thank you. So with ethical considerations with this,
we're largely looking at some of the areas around, like, why are we testing independently? It can be hard to prove the completeness and honestly the legitimacy of some in-house testing. And so some of the in-house testing might not always be fully authentic and fully accurate. And so it's essentially just a set of checks through multiple different parties. Is that about right for sort of the ethical concerns there?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're really just making sure that someone who should be responsible for this, there are multiple sets of eyes on the product, multiple people reviewing it. And most importantly, some of the regulators are concerned about, the comprehensive testing. Independent testers aren't going to have the attachment to it that the manufacturers have. They are going to cover everything and they're going to pick out every little problem they can find. So there are a few reasons really that we're covering it there. Now, as far as security requirement testing, this is generally a little different. This should be done oftentimes as part of that software V&V by the engineers. They know the code better than anyone else, and so they're going to have the best process for that verification and validation. That validation is ensuring requirements have been put in place. Static and dynamic code analysis and SBOM vulnerability analysis can be done a few different ways. Generally, we recommend it as a one-off test as well as a continuous integration. So a continuous integration means that as changes are made to the source code, engineers are making any tweaks. There are a lot of tweaks that happen. And so any tweaks are run through these checks before they're pushed out into the product. It catches them early on the beginning phases. That term in engineering is called sliding it left, so towards the beginning of the project. We also recommend doing it as part of a one-off test, as input to penetration testing. Identification, just running an additional check every so often, maybe see what a different tool generates for the output. Vulnerability assessments should generally be done during design freezes and act as input to penetration testing. So a design freeze means the application or the product is getting to a certain point where it's not expected to change a ton. The reason we want to wait there to do a lot of vulnerability assessments is they're often looking at a little bit more of how the product is interacting with other components, and so how the system interacts within itself and externally. That isn't always going to be possible through an iterative approach the same way that scanning code is. And as input to penetration testing, we went over this a little bit earlier, but vulnerability assessments are wide. They cover a lot of ground, but they don't go very deep. It can act as a good place for a penetration tester to understand where they want to start focusing, but it's not necessarily going to have that same coverage. All right, now let's look at some of the key takeaways and the main things that we wanted to cover here. The first point and the most important point is that sufficient security testing is mandatory. This isn't optional. Used to be before the 2023 guidance that submissions could go through without security testing, but those times have changed, and this is now a mandatory step on the way to compliance. The FDA requires numerous different testing activities. It can't just be a penetration test. It can't just be a code test. NIST Special Publication 800-115 lays out all of these different activities. In addition to providing assurance to the regulators, cybersecurity testing provides assurance to customers. This is saying that your device is secure. You can integrate it into your network with minimal risk, and we're providing proof of that. Security testing should be performed by security experts, specifically in the medical space. The medical space is extremely tightly regulated, and there are different metrics that we're considering. Things like patient harm, things like protected health information. This is not standard across every industry, so we just have to be aware of it here. Now, tooling used for testing should be vetted and secure with cutting-edge security testing techniques. Ultimately, what we're trying to do for security testing and penetration testing is simulate an attacker. We're acting like the bad guys. That means that we have to be as good, if not better, than they are. So we have to identify all of these problems before them. We have to be more comprehensive and thorough than they are. They're using the cutting-edge security techniques, so that means we have to as well. Testing should be thorough and comprehensive with a focus on patient harm. Any risk assessments, any risk scoring should take this all into consideration. What could happen to an individual? What could happen to PHI? That's ultimately what we're looking at here. All right, that's about everything we have for today. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about some of these cybersecurity testing services and understanding how some of the best ways to get your device cleared are, you can reach out to us at bluegoatcyber.com and book a discovery meeting where we'd be happy to help guide you down that process and go through some of these testing activities with you. I want to thank Myles so much for joining me on this webinar. This has been a fantastic, insightful conversation on some security testing with some amazing case studies and stories that we've gone over.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next month during our next monthly webinar.